Even if you're not a comic book fan, you most likely know who the Hulk is, Captain America, Thor, the Avengers, the X-Men, Giant Man, the Black Panther, the Silver Surfer, the Fantastic Four, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the Inhumans, Groot, Sandman, the Demon, maybe even Darkseid. If you've heard of any of these characters, then you are already familiar with the tiniest fraction of the countless creations or co-creations of one Jack Kirby. Not simply an artist or writer, over the course of more than 50 years, Kirby was a force, arguably the most prolific and innovative creator in the history of comic books, influencing generations of not just comic creators, but authors, artists, and filmmakers. When Kirby passed in 1994 at the age of 76, he left behind a legacy of stories and characters that have sparked the imaginations of millions and made tens of billions of dollars for Disney's Marvel and Warner Brothers' DC Comics. On August 28, 2017, Kirby would have been 100 years old. There have been and will continue to be many tributes to the man often referred to as the King. And occasionally, because we love comics, and especially Jack Kirby, over the next few months, Pop Goes the Culture is going to spend some time talking about Kirby enthusiasm. Hi, it's David Levin, and we are on Pop Goes the Culture today, and we are talking about the great Jack Kirby. And today I'm with Paul Levitz, the former president and publisher of DC Comics and one of my favorite comic book writers. Welcome aboard, Paul.
Thank you, sir. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks. So today we're talking about Jack Kirby. It's the centennial of his birth, and the question I've asked a lot of people is, why is Kirby, quote-unquote, the king? There's a million comic book artists out there and a lot of comic book creators. Why is Kirby held in such high regard?
Jack was a wonderful combination of things. First of all, he was, in many ways, the first brand name in comics. Mm-hmm. Simon and Kirby are the first creators in the comic book field to be identified by name to try and sell comics in the 1940s. He goes on to be the creator or co-creator of so much of the mythology of comics, from Captain America to romance comics in the 1940s, most of the Marvel characters in the 1960s, and much of the Marvel universe, even beyond the characters themselves. Wonderful Fourth World material that he did for DC coming into the 1970s, which established a storytelling style for doing big cosmic things that had not been part of comics before. And then at the beginning of the real indie movement, he's the first really major creator to try an indie book, to try and do his own stuff where he can own it himself. The only one of the guys of that first generation who's still interesting and vital and as well courageous enough to be doing a basic format periodical comic of new characters, but something with his own copyright and control. On top of all that, he was a really, really nice man.
You knew him?
I knew Jack a little. We worked together a tiny bit.
Right. Well, you worked with him at the end of his mainstream comic book career, I guess, when he came back to DC, correct?
I knew Jack from my comic fan days. Mm-hmm. He did the cover for the last issue of my fanzine. Mm-hmm. Still can't remember whether I paid him $15 or whether he just did it as a thank you for his free subscription. It's a pretty damn good deal either way.
Either way.
When he was at DC at the sort of tail end of his 1970s commitment, as a young assistant editor, there was a period there where I was the one responsible for making sure there was something there for him to draw the following week, which was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And developed some kind of relationship with both him and Roz out of that. And then when he came back to DC briefly in the 1980s to kind of wrap up the New Gods work he had done a decade before and do some fresh design work on the Fourth World characters. I had the fun of working out the contract that gave him a piece of the revenues from Darkseid and the Fourth World characters, which was something we were very happy to be able to find a way to do, and he was extremely happy about at that time.
That was a big deal at the time, I remember. And can you contextualize just how big a deal that was? Because I think people who sort of assume that everybody makes a ton of money from these things, I mean, certainly they're billion-dollar properties, but at that time it was very unusual for someone to get that sort of deal.
Well, DC had begun to do deals with creators for new projects and new properties in the late 1970s under the auspices of Jeanette Kahn, who was then the company's president, in order to encourage more new things to be created. 1970s, particularly the late 1970s, had become a very dry period in mainstream comics. And newer, fairer deals were a necessity. And Jeanette was wise enough to see that and move us in that direction. It was very hard to find a way to go backwards. The legal complications were significant, the precedent complications were significant, and the business logic was difficult to turn around and say, hey, you did this work 10, 20, 30 years ago. Let us give you a better deal than you had then and bind the company. It was very hard to find a business justification that made that a viable thing to do in most cases. Jack was having a very rough time in the early 80s fighting with Marvel about his original art. He had not, at that point, received any revenue from his creations from Marvel, other than what he'd gotten in his page rate when he'd originally done the stories. And it was kind of a ruckus in the field, and we had a lot of sympathy for it. We had just done a deal with Kenner Toys to create one of the first kind of modern action figure lines of the DC characters. DC was never great on villains. It was not the great strength in our mythology.
Right.
And we thought of Darkseid and the Fourth World as being a great way to make that a better line, a more commercial toy line, and also to enhance what we were doing with Hanna-Barbera with the Super Friends on television, sort of all connecting it together. That gave us a project that, because Jack was still a great artist and still a great designer, and actually also understood animation by that time, because he'd done a great deal of work for Ruby Spears, that we were able to engage Jack to do some new development work on the characters. And that gave us a suitable business reason to be able to open Pandora's box and say, okay, in this case, it's okay to go backwards. We've not had any real revenue from these characters so far. Maybe with this new development work, we can make that happen. And let's take this great artist. We want him on board with it. We want him supporting it publicly. We want him happy about it. Let's give him an appropriate little piece of the action. Jack was, I think, thrilled. He said many kind things about us at the time. And certainly for many years thereafter was prone to comment that he had made more money from Darkseid than he did off everything he had created for Marvel.
Wow.
Which was simultaneously sad and heartwarming, at least for me.
Yeah. Nice to know that you had something positive to offer him towards the end of his life and his career. Talk about what it was like working with him creatively. I mean, you got to do that a little bit. What was he like in the heat of creation?
I think Jack's great gift was the depth of his imagination. He was probably the most fertile of the first generation creators. And that really continued well into his at least late 50s, maybe early 60s, he would just have idea after idea after idea. Not all of them were wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for every Silver Surfer, you had a Black Racer.
I like the Black Racer.
It seemed like an okay idea at the time, I guess. The legend is that Roz would not let him drive the car because she was afraid he'd go off in a daydream and plow them into a tree. It seemed pretty believable to me. That fertility, that ability to keep seeing new things in the universe is a very, very rare gift. Very few of his successors in creating comics had more than one or two great ideas in their life. One or two great ideas is wonderful. It's one or two more than I've had. I'm totally envious of it.
Oh, I wouldn't say that.
But Jack had dozens. And he would just, I think, close his eyes and dream and start thinking about what could be. An article he'd read, something he'd seen on TV, a tree he passed, an old myth that he'd read when he was a child, a Yiddish folk tale that he'd heard. Often you don't know where things come from.
Right.
But he had this wonderful ability to process it all, come up with things. And for certain stretches of his career, particularly the period from about 1960 to 1970, 1972, a really high percentage of it was in tune with the zeitgeist or ahead of the zeitgeist.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really amazing.
Yeah, it really is. So I remember the first time I got punched in the gut by a Kirby picture or something. What was your first punch in the gut from Kirby?
You know, I was a real DC kid growing up.
So was I.
My mom didn't let me buy more than 3 comics a week. So I remember a running debate with my friend Alan, who lived a few houses down, who was a great Fantastic Four fan while I was holding firm to the Legion of Superheroes. And as a mature adult looking back, I think Alan had a pretty good case. Mm-hmm. At the time, it didn't catch me quite that much. My real joy in Jack's work starts with the Fourth World. I was doing the fanzines right as that started, so I saw many of those issues in the original art as they arrived at DC.
Wow.
And he poured so much passion into that, so much imagination, it just leapt off the page. There really hadn't been anything like it ever done in comics before.
It was pretty remarkable. What is his legacy right now? What do you think? I mean, there's so many movies and TV shows, and the public isn't even aware of all the different little places where, Kirby did that, he did that.
Well, it's not just the characters he worked on or the stories he worked on that have gotten adapted to film or television or continue in comics, though all of those are true. But a lot of his legacy is a set of visual language. Jack defined for a generation or more of creative people who followed how to create action and excitement visually. He had a unique ability to violate the laws of good drawing to good effect. Yeah. Kind of whatever the artistic equivalent of literary license is. He warped perspective, he warped anatomy, and the figures leapt off the page. They fought with each other with a dynamic that really helped shape the language of visual action as we see it in many different media forms. So whether it's a video game or an animated cartoon, even if it's not anything that Jack touched, even if the art style doesn't mimic the way Jack drew his lines or the kind of square-jawed people who marched through his stories, the storytelling style, the way of making something impactful has his initials hidden in the corner. And you'll hear the artists acknowledge that very cheerfully. Part, again, of why he's the king in many ways. Mm-hmm. It's a sustaining influence that's really potentially only equaled by one or two other artists of that first generation in comics.
Even as a kid, early on, I noticed things that he did, especially when I sort of got into that place where I was reading Dickens. Kirby utilized a lot of things that comic books hadn't used in terms of storytelling at that point. Foreshadowing, sprinkling little bits of elements that wouldn't come to fruition until issues later that were not really done prior to that. It was always episodic. Even continued stories, they were, okay, the continued story and it ends. And I noticed that Kirby would sprinkle in hints of something that was going to come, and then later on it would come. And eventually that became a regular thing in comics. I felt like Kirby was one of the first people to do that.
Yes and no. You know, where I'm going to disagree with you is not in that it happened first in things that he drew, but I doubt that it was intentional.
Interesting.
I think Jack just tossed the ideas in there. He was, particularly in the Marvel years, when he was collaborating with Stan, mostly, not planning where things were going much. He was taking a germ of a plot idea that Stan had presented to him, and he was just shoveling ideas into it. And you can see, because of the different lives the two of them led, the different ways their mind worked, you can see their thumbprint on different things.
Give me an example. Like what?
The Yancey Street Gang. Jack was born on Essex Street, a building that's still standing in Manhattan, a couple of blocks away from Delancey Street, which then was a very tough neighborhood. Now is a not yet gentrified neighborhood, would be the kindest way of putting it.
Okay.
Stan was not a Yancey Street kid. Jack was. Jack was a street fighter. He'd gotten into turf battles in New York, it was usually one ethnic against another. So whether it was the Italian kids versus the Jewish kids, the Irish kids, I don't know the exact stories of the battles, but you could see that was his world coming in. Did he have a plan for it? When he did a page of them confronting the Thing the first time, 99 of 100, there wasn't an additional thought in his head. It was, this is the story I got to get done. Remember, he was working in those prime years at a pace of as much as 6 penciled pages a day.
That's nuts. That's crazy.
More than a week's output for most of today's comic artists. And he was doing that on the double-sized boards, so it was physically more labor. He was doing it mostly from rough plots, so he was also doing structuring and choreographing and storytelling, as well as just literally drawing it.
And 5 to 9 panels per page, usually, at that point.
Absolutely. It's an astounding amount of work. I don't think he stopped to think about much of anything.
To eat, maybe.
Probably, and I suspect that was Roz putting a bowl of food in front of him. Jack, you've got to stop and at least have some lunch. God bless him.
Eat your dishes.
Very little of what was done in those years was done with a grand plan. when you talk about foreshadowing.
Mm-hmm.
Most of it, much of the best of it, was simply the idea that you've got now to make it to the end of this story, and then maybe a month later, 2 months later, if you were good and your memory worked well and your imagination was focused, you'd say, oh yeah, that thing I tossed in, that could be a whole issue now. Or if your memory wasn't so good, and we can name quite a number of Jack's fellow practitioners of that time who suffered that, you would go back and you'd do a story that was completely contrary to the one you'd done before, because you didn't remember what you'd worked on a month ago because you'd been working so fast and so hard.
Right. And so many things all at once.
It's amazing. When I was writing multiple series at the same time, I'd have file folders full of notes, blank notebooks, jotting down ideas, scorecards of where I last left each storyline in which issue, and I still screwed it up every now and then. They screwed it up. They screwed it up too here and there, but they covered their mistakes so beautifully.
Yeah. You worked with one of your best collaborators, Keith Giffen, who often and on occasion has been known to sort of riff in a very Kirby-esque style. Did you guys ever talk about this? About Kirby?
Yeah. I mean, Keith's an enormous admirer of Jack's, and in many ways, in terms of imagination, at least out of the guys I've worked with and experienced, is probably the closest we come to somebody with Jack's level of fertility.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he'll help develop a Lobo and an ambush bug. And you're really across the alphabet in terms of types of creative concepts there. And again, like Jack, an awful lot of what Keith would come up with is just sort of, okay, can we skip that one now, please, and never mention it again? But a lot of it was astounding. And it always has been a joy to play with Keith because of that. I admire that gift tremendously.
What are you working on these days?
About half my time's teaching now,
mm-hmm.
which is great fun. I get to steal energy from the young people. I go in as a vampire.
Good.
On the writing front, I just finished up the publication of the last episode of Brooklyn Blood in Dark Horse Presents. The last of the trade paperbacks for my Dr. Fate material for DC came out about a month ago. And this afternoon, I finally finished the first script for my next little mini-series project for Dark Horse.
Very nice.
Keeps me out of trouble, mostly.
Listen, keeping out of trouble is half the battle, my friend. Paul Levitz, thank you so much for talking to me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for celebrating Jack. He was a sweetie.
He was the best. Thanks very much.